We also need to think about community infrastructure. That widespread pattern of urbanization also wreaked havoc on the family, and today we know we have much more diverse types of families and living situations, and we need to build strong architecture that becomes the hubs of communities and consider that infrastructure as well. And also we need to think about green infrastructure. This is a map showing how urbanization is spreading across the United States, and you can see how urban centers are bleeding into each other. So what that does is it disconnects places and green places for animals and biodiversity to expand, cutting off crucial green connections.
There's significant evidence in the financial and psychological benefits of urban greenery. Green roofs increase biodiversity and reduce rainwater runoff, mitigating the effect of storms and reducing the risk of urban flooding. And views of trees and plants have been shown to make the sick recover more quickly and to improve mental health. In London, research has demonstrated that in areas with higher densities of urban trees, there are lower rates of antidepressant prescriptions. So if we can design our buildings to include plants and trees and greenery, we're not only benefiting individuals, but we're supporting the community at large. So when these ideas become intrinsic to the design process, when we think about the big picture, we can create buildings that do extraordinary things, buildings that strengthen the local community and connect people to one another, buildings that support the local economy both in how they are built and in how they work, buildings that filter the air, that increase biodiversity, that improve health and well-being, and that support the environment.
Over the past few decades, evolutionary biologists have come to realize that sometimes evolution proceeds much faster, and it can actually be observed, especially when the environment changes drastically and the need to adapt is great. And all these environmental changes reach their epicenter in cities. Cities form a completely new habitat that we have created, and we clothe it in brick and concrete and glass and steel, which are impervious surfaces that plants can only root in with the greatest difficulty. Also in cities we find the greatest concentrations of chemical pollution, of artificial light and noise. And we find wild mixtures of plants and animals from all over the world that live in the city because they've escaped from the gardening and aquarium and pet trade. And what does a species do when it lives in a completely changed environment? Well, many, of course, go sadly extinct. But the ones that don't go extinct, they adapt in spectacular ways. Biologists these days are beginning to realize that cities are today's pressure cookers of evolution. These are places where wild animals and plants are evolving under our eyes very rapidly to suit these new urban conditions. For example, in Central Park, we find that the mice have evolved genes that allow them to deal with very fatty food. Human food. 25 million people visit Central Park each year. It's the most heavily visited park in North America. And those people leave behind snack food and peanuts and junk food, and the mice have started feeding on that. And it's a completely different diet than what they're used to. And over the years, they have evolved to suit this very fatty, very human diet.
I was using satellite imagery and field research to study these amazing, cute pollinators and to see how they were doing in the midst of their own environmental crisis in Southern California. And from the macro view, I saw 22-lane freeways, endless suburban sprawl, and water being diverted from parched rivers to grow lawns in the desert. It was pretty grim. But on the ground, there were actually some small opportunities for optimism. These tiny patches of resources known as habitat fragments. if the right kinds of plants were growing along the edges of a Costco parking lot, and if in the neighborhoods nearby there were native plants in people's gardens, and in the canyons that were too steep for people to put their suburbs in, there were native plants instead of grasses, then all of these in-between spaces would actually add up to create a network of habitat fragments. And this network meant that the bees could traverse through the concrete desert, feeding from and pollinating the native plants.